Welcome to Too Much Music,
a show where two music know-it-alls talk about making music in a world
that probably already has a little too much music in it.
Allow me to introduce Alison. She's an indie hero who has written thousands of songs and can rock a pedal board like nobody's business.
But I also have graduate degrees in music theory and know quite a bit about how the brain processes music. And this here is Greg. He's a legitimate conservatory-trained doctor of music who can conceive of musical sounds that we mere mortals can't even comprehend.
Okay, yeah, but I'm also an old-school 80s goth, and I'm currently living on the road and producing music out of a studio that I built in my RV.
We used to be married.
But now, we just have this podcast. Okay, we're rolling.
Yeah! Hey, everybody!
Welcome back!
If you're listening to this, you can't see, but Greg just did some very calisthenic arm motions.
We've been sitting for a while. We're on part two.
Fantastic. Yeah, we're in a part two of a two-part episode, and I think we're going to try to keep it to two parts. So we're gonna do everything we can to keep this as brief as we can. This amazing topic that we're covering, which is we're looking at the differences between art music of the pasty white European lineage and pop music of the American South blues music lineage. And, you know, what we said last time was we care about this because we're musicians ourselves and we really want to be clear about what we're doing. We want to understand the music that came before us and we want to understand how it's influencing us to make our own music. So that's actually, this is a very selfish reason, but that's the real deal. That's why we talk about this stuff, at least Greg and me. Maybe for you it's different. Maybe you're actually interested in things for reasons that aren't selfish, but you're not going to find that here. You know, Greg and I, and again, just to recap a little bit, Greg and I have been talking about this for you know, 10, 15 years, however long we've known each other. I don't know how long that is at this point, but a long time, probably 15 years. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, over that time, I really have come to see a lot of his wisdom on this front. And at first I know. At first I had a lot of, there was a lot of resistance that I felt to this concept that there were some fundamental differences between these two types of music. But as I started to talk to him about it and think about it a little bit less emotionally, I guess I found that there are. It's pretty clear and demonstrable.
And it's worth maybe pointing out that you felt emotional and a little defensive about it, I think, because you are a singer-songwriter. You've got a lot of training and you have worked in art music. You have done that. You have composed art music. I mean, you've done both, but at heart, you're a singer-songwriter. That's what speaks to you. And I am an art music composer. I feel dissatisfaction with the state of things and want to invent and move beyond in a certain kind of way. And the social implications, which we'll get into here, which are negative, and we don't agree with this. We don't subscribe to this at all. But the social implication typically is that pop music is trite, pop music is lesser, and it's absolutely, yeah, it's easy. And it is true that it would be very difficult to be an untrained or intuitive classical musician. You can't play a Rachmaninoff piano concerto if you without decades of devoted practice. But you can pick up a guitar and play a Beatles song without that kind of training. So there's an immediate sort of assumption about what that means there. But they're not. That's not what we feel. That's not what's going on here at all. This is not about one being better or lesser.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you brought up that particular idea and example. I know you don't have an outline and you actually don't really know what we're about to talk about.
No, you're leading this. This is your show. Your beach.
That is actually the first thing on my outline. In this episode, we're really talking about cultural concerns. And those bleed into musical concerns and specific musical things. But I think we're going to focus on that set of traits about music that have to do with its interaction with people, both the people who create it, the people who make it possible financially, the people who listen to it. All of these people have an effect on music. So what are the real differences culturally in these two different musical worlds that, by the way, do absolutely overlap and have a lot to do with each other today? So the first bit of that I do want to talk about is something you were just alluding to, which is performance practice. And what you brought up right away, almost as if you're reading my outline, was
I'm not.
The idea of the trained musician, or what I would call the technical or even virtuosic musician, versus a self-taught musician. And I will say that my personal experience in this is very much, I have taken many a musical lesson. I started studying piano. I learned to read music, at 2 or 3 years old. But I have never been, and I've always known this about myself, I have never wanted to be a virtuosic musician. I actually don't want to be great at anything. That's kind of just who I am.
My God.
I like to experience lots and lots of different things. And if you're that type of person, you're probably never going to get to be a true expert at any one thing. And that
we like to call that breadth, not depth.
Breadth, not depth.
Yeah, I'm depth, not breadth.
I feel like you could really slip up and say some weird stuff there. So we're gonna move on past those words.
All right.
But yeah, so I can play many, many instruments passably. To a non-expert ear, they might even think I'm kind of good at some of them. But I can, I can't play virtuosic music on any instrument. And this really has been a choice in my life. And the reason I have made that choice, frankly, is that the music that I care the most about, which falls into this popular music tradition, the music that I write, that I really make, doesn't require that. It just, and in fact, it almost is a hindrance in making that kind of music in a certain way. So talk to me about virtuosity in art music, Greg.
Well, so, my whole take on this has been quite different. I started playing piano at 3, and that's what I've done my whole life. My DMA is in piano and composition. So, I took it all the way. And and then spent a good decade making a living as a pianist. So, pianist and composer both, but I have played many, many instruments, as a composer needs to do, to be aware of how a trombone works, and to know about the physical hardships in playing a trombone. So you don't write idiotic music that a trombonist can't play. But that's not where but I have been I've studied piano. So, and you say that was that could be a hindrance. I want to know more about that, why you think that could have been a hindrance to you. Because for me, it means that I can do many things. I can command my hands to do many, many different things. Whatever I might hear, I can manifest, which is a bit like wizardry. But I think that's powerful. I'm not limited ever by my ability. I don't think I haven't yet been by my ability to execute something in the studio.
I'm glad you challenged me on that that idea that it's a hindrance. And I don't actually, that's not exactly what I think.
Okay.
And I can speak to that more. I think what would be far more of a hindrance is for me to spend the type of time that's necessary to develop those skills and maintain them, because you can't just learn to play the piano until you're 20 and then just keep playing it that way. You absolutely have to keep playing, as any older pianist will tell you who stops for a while, including Greg. It's not quite like riding a bicycle.
No. It's much more like being an athlete, like a professional athlete or an Olympian or something. You might remember how it feels to do something, but when your body doesn't respond, you have to retrain, and there's all sorts of things. And I'm super limited now. I'm 50. I'm limited in what I can do just physically, but also just I don't play the way I used to. So I'm very limited. But I still have enough facility that I can certainly make it happen. But I see what you mean.
Than like everyone. Yeah. So it's not really. If I could just instantly right now play like you, if I had the facility that you have, which is far greater on the piano, far greater than my own facility. Yeah, I think I could record better parts. That's actually the difference, I would say. But I don't think it's actually 100% necessary for the musical ideas that I have and that I want to get across, and the affects that I want to create. So, yeah, I think that I don't have to spend that time, and I can spend that time doing things that inform my music in ways that are more important to me. Like gardening, like I can just garden, and that makes me a better song. Sorry.
What are you doing with the gardening? Oh, you better bring in some pictures of like roses and stuff. I don't know. You better prove this gardening thing.
Cottage
or whatever you're gardening.
No, yeah, Greg and I have not lived together for 3-4 years now, something like that. And I wouldn't. I'm laughing because I never would have ever thought that I would like to garden, and I just feel it cracks me up that I'm so into it right now.
Yeah. And it's odd because too, I was like Mr. like living in the city, like that was my whole, it's all I ever wanted to do. And I live literally in the woods where bears are just like pooping on, right outside my door. Like that's what's going on. Like
you
it's
have
just
to
a
wash
wild,
your dog every day.
because she rolls in it. It's smells good. No, it doesn't.
Bear poop
Okay.
is
But
really
anyway,
gross.
but here we are. I'm living in the middle of, nature.
Tangent. You're living in the middle of Tangent Land, which is where we both are living.
Sorry, I don't have the outline. It's your job as the host.
It's really not it's not a great outline. It doesn't really have, it looks like a crazy person wrote it, and it has like 5 words on it.
Because you were too busy gardening.
Yeah,
right.
I did actually have to go out and water this morning. It's true. So anyway, this idea of physical, I mean, the idea of a musician being an athlete, like an athlete in that way, is something that is, I think, not super obvious to people who haven't had, at least, who haven't either had that experience or at least been adjacent to people like that.
Oh my goodness! Even
really
when I was at Eastman, there were people taking performance enhancing drugs, and I'm not kidding.
Yeah,
to do this.
I'm someone who has a ton of respect for, and am one of these people myself. Somebody who, who might play several instruments or just play rock guitar really well, for example. Just perform that role in their band in this way that's just amazing. And of course there are popular musicians who are virtuosic too. That's what I'm sure, I would be thinking if I were listening to this. But it's a very different type of virtuosity, I would say, most of the time. It'll be rare that you find a pop musician who has they may have mastered their own style at a level that's really impressive. You can think of a ton of guitarists like this, especially. But they probably haven't gone and studied guitar and played a lot of other people's music, for example. So maybe that's a big difference, like focusing on just your own style versus unlearning all of these other masterworks for your instrument.
And then, I can think of, I'm not, as we know, I don't know a lot about pop music, but I can think of a couple of examples where that's not the case. Like Chris Teal.
Actually, I don't know if it's Tyler Teal.
Tyler Teal.
The guy from the Punch Brothers. He plays mandolin.
Yep. And he'll make arrangements of Bach lute suites or Debussy or something like that. I've heard him do that, and it's very virtuosic, and he's a virtuoso on his instrument, and that makes him, I think, a better band leader and all kinds of things. But to get there, I don't know where you would study mandolin that way. I don't know much about his history, but my point is that has advantages to him.
That
clearly.
bluegrass scene that he's a part of, the newgrass bluegrass scene, is actually a really interesting example. This is slightly tangential.
Is it called newgrass?
That people do call it new. I don't know if I don't know enough to know whether his music and his groups fall into that, but I bet he does. Like the other person I'm thinking of is Sarah Jarosz. Sarah Jarosz gave me a complex when I first started hearing her music, because her singing is, if you've never heard her, she's a bluegrass musician. I would say she's like the successor to Alison Krauss, maybe, in bluegrass, if you know of her. And she has this voice that is just so striking and so unbelievable and instantly effective when you hear it. And also, if you know anything about singing or have tried to sing yourself, what you quickly realize when you hear her sing is that she is a virtuoso of the voice. She can do things that are incredibly difficult. She has a massive amount of control. Is
she trained? I mean, how did she acquire this? Yeah,
this is the question that I asked after I listened to her for a while, because I was like, why can't I do that? Like, why can't I do that? I think I have the physical capacity to do it, but I can't do it. And now I've never had vocal training. That's one instrument that I have not studied with a teacher. And so I looked it up, and sure enough, she went to Juilliard. Like yes, she has the absolute, Now she did focus the whole time. She didn't quite do it she has a really weird history. So she grew up as a bluegrass star. She started singing bluegrass music. She was in that culture, right, in Appalachia. I don't know, Kentucky or where, but somewhere down in the heart of that music. And she started singing that music at a young age. And
so she's like the Jason Bateman of newgrass.
The Jason Bateman of Newgrass. I'm sure she would appreciate that.
Well, my point being that that's a guy who started as a young person, was surrounded by it, and had every advantage, and then made something really fantastic out of it as an adult in many ways.
Yeah, she was a child star in that same way. That's right. In her niche. But what she did, and this is what I found interesting, and I apologize if I'm butchering the story because I didn't intend to talk about her, and I haven't looked. It's
not on the outline
in years. It's so not on the outline.
You were gardening. You did not have. Okay. Yes. Go ahead. Sorry.
So she, at some point when she was a young person, a teenager, a late teenager, she decided that she wanted that serious training, and there was someone at Juilliard. I forget who the teacher was. Maybe it was like. Anyway, I don't want to mess it up, but it was somebody really important to her, and she went to study with them, and so she went through that sequence of study. And I don't know if she got a degree or what she did, but she did have real live vocal training that comes out of this European tradition, which is insanely different from playing your guitar every day in the style that's natural to you, which is more what I do. Guitar in particular. People are missing it if you're audio only. My dog is rolling.
We have ring dog. Dogs are rolling in the sunspot there. It's really nice. Okay.
Oh, Pepper.
Okay, so
sorry.
That's all right.
So yeah, the idea of training, and I actually think it's worth you talking a little bit about. So Greg studied privately with a very important composer, 20th century American composer called George Rochberg. And his music is unfreaking believable. More people should hear it. So if you're listening to this, go listen. What's the entry piece for George?
I would say the entry piece is his third string quartet, 1975. I think that's a reasonable place to start, but George Rochberg, just look it up.
If we remember, we'll put it in the show notes. We probably won't,
there's another one, Music for the Magic Theater, that was a very important piece. And it's
That's
amazing.
An amazing piece. Yeah.
For many reasons.
Okay, so one of the things that is always, Greg has told me a lot over the years about conversations that he had with George and ways that George felt about things. And it's been really cool for me to be able to kind of secondhand get this knowledge from this person who's, I don't agree with him, probably 90% of the time, but he is a true master and understands music better than anyone, probably. Top 3 people I'll ever meet. So, or not meet. I never met him. So tell us, I want you to talk about what George would say about performing about being able to perform as a composer and how that's important.
Well, right. So he was a pianist, and he would say, for sure, that, when you're a composer, you're writing music for the performer. That's your audience, is for the performer. You need to give them something to play. Something that will challenge them, that will make them want to come back to it, and will make them want to put it on stage and fight for you. They're your advocate in a way. So what he would say about that is to do that, to know how to do that. You can't theoretically understand what it feels like to be in front of an audience, or to master a piece of music, or to master an instrument. You need to do that yourself at some level. You need to approach that mastery. I mean, you may not be Rubinstein, but you need to attempt that and understand what they are struggling against, understand what that feels like, understand what making music, what it means to play Chopin on the piano, because it's not, Chopin wrote music for the piano, and specifically I bring him up because that music is extraordinarily idiomatic. Like you need an acoustic piano to make Chopin work. To make melodies sing. It's all about creating the illusion on the instrument. Okay, sorry, I'm sort of rambling into a whole world of things here, but the point is, as a composer, if you're going to make music that's going to sound well, okay, on the instruments that you want, you need to know what that process feels like and internalize it to the point where George would say you have a mastery of that. You have a mastery where you don't think about this, you simply know. How to start melodies, how to spread harmony over sonically over an instrument, how that feels, what that means.
So I would say you have personally embodied all of these things instead of just, my approach was, instead of, like I said, I didn't want to spend the time to do that, frankly. So what I did is I did it in a cerebral way. I studied the scores and listened very hard. And that's a very different approach to learning about this music.
This really brings up something I just thought of. I think it's really illustrative, maybe. So, in pop music, for the most part, I've not spent a lot of time around pop musicians, but I know enough to know that the way they talk to each other. Okay, so in classical music, what you do as the composer in art music, you write everything down. And you write it down as specifically as you can, and you're oftentimes you're over notating so that you can communicate what you want them to do, and the effect that you want to have, even when it's not physically, tangibly possible on the instrument. You want them to what you want them to do to create the illusion of something. Well, in pop music circles, instead, you don't do that. You don't get specific up to the bass player or to the guitar player if you're the songwriter and singer. You walk up to them and you let them do what they know to do on the instrument. You don't tell them all specifically how to do it. You might say, do it like a taka taka or whatever. You're going to make these goofy sounds, and I call that composer voice. You're gonna do the chicka chicka cha, okay, whatever. But you're gonna sort of try and get across a feel to them. But you're not going to tell them how to do it specifically because you want them to bring their artistry to it and find a way to do it right. That's a big difference, I think, in just because you're not going to communicate that on the written page. You're not going to be that specific. And so the singer-songwriter doesn't need to know. You just need to have a good band member that you can depend on.
Pretty creeped out right now because that
is true?
Literally the next... Well, it is true.
Okay.
I mean, I think there, just as in all things that we're talking about in this episode, this double episode, there are exceptions, very clear and important exceptions to that. But I think overall, archetypally, yeah, that's usually how it happens. But what's weirding me out is that is literally my next bullet point on my five.
It's like your outline is, a natural progression. And I haven't seen your outline, so there you go. I don't know.
Well, it's like we've had this conversation 8 million times.
That's true.
So, so the next point that I wanted to talk about is almost exactly that, which is, what is the canonical version of art music and what is the canonical version of pop music, and how did those two, how does a piece of art music become instantiated? How does it become embodied? How does it become real in the world, as opposed to pop music? How do those two things happen? And I'll start from the pop music side.
Good,
because I do know an awful lot about that. So
yeah, I know less.
Yeah, there are a number of ways it could happen. I think one really, really, really critical piece of it is the songwriter, right? And so this is, in most cases, it kind of depends on what type of popular music you're talking about. But I would say if we're looking at one archetypal way it happens, a person sits down with an instrument and their voice alone in a room and creates something, right? They create a structure that involves melodies, lyrics, and harmonies and rhythms, right? Just a basic. Here's the song. You can play it on acoustic guitar. You can play it on piano. It doesn't really matter what the texture is. None of it matters because it's the framework for what's coming next. Which the next part. So what is the version that people actually hear? What's the most important version? I think most people would say in pop music, it's the version on the record. Like, that's actually what people live with. That's what people care about. And that really has changed over time. And I think, in the first iteration of pop music, so maybe from Tin Pan Alley into the 50s and 60s, let's say, the way people made records was, and this was partially technological limitations and partially this is just how you would do it, if you didn't think to do it another way, is they would get the people together in the room, they would set up the mics, and they would capture a live performance. That is not how we make music anymore. Nothing like that. I mean, people still do that, and that's a choice that you can make, but 95%, probably way more than that, of recordings made today are in the tradition of, I'll just say the Beatles tradition, because that's where this studio art form started being made, very popular and famous. Was the Beatles in the middle of their career started crafting these studio creations that really can't be played live. Honestly, you can always figure out a way to do it, but it's designed to be heard on the record. So I would say if today there's an archetypal canonical version of any song in popular music. It is the recorded version that's released on the album that everybody knows. That's the first place you hear the song. So what about in art music? How do people think about it there?
Yeah, it couldn't be more different. In art music, it's the composer is, like we said, being very specific and writing this stuff down on a score. And then, and this is what's really interesting, because what you were talking about is you have this raw idea, it gets communicated, it gets recorded, it gets crystallized there. And no, but here it's in the score, it's crystallized. And then what often happens, depending, is someone or some group will try to perform this. It often doesn't go well, right? And in fact, it's most common that these things are, there are many, many classic examples of this, but early recordings of The Rite of Spring, for example, are just awful. They're just terrible because it was a little bit beyond what the ensemble could manage, and these are the best ensembles of the world at the time. But people didn't know what it was supposed to sound like. But now you can hear these unbelievable, I mean, because almost 100 years or more than 100 years has passed. So we now know how it's crystallized. What I'm saying is the ideal of the score. So it started out with this mess on record, right? Like the Disney recording or whatever it's just not very good. That's, I think, where it was maybe not first recorded, but it's an early recording. Now you can hear unbelievable recordings of The Rite of Spring.
So you're saying that, so we talked about in our last episode in all these different ways how composers, so art music composers, are kind of obsessed with pushing the envelope, with moving the language forward, and so they're actually doing this in terms of performance practice as well. They're actually saying to musicians, you have to get better. You have to be better athletes. You need to take those performance enhancing drugs in order to play my music. And you know, one of the amazing things about performers, and I do find this astounding, and it is very similar to athletes, is that they do it. They you know, over time, the course of the 20th century, if you go back and listen to the great pianists then and now, which is cool, we can do that now. We have over 100 years of recorded music. Yep. The pianists today wipe the floor with those pianists, technically. Now, I'm not saying that they're better musicians. I'm just saying that envelope has been pushed so far that they can do. They're more athletic. It's like yes, you know, it's like the I don't know anything about sports. It's like the 100-yard dash is probably run a lot faster than it used to be. Sprinters are faster, right? And it's the same with music.
And the precision is there in ways. I mean, you recently were in New York and you saw the ensemble in Contemporain, right? And it's unbelievable. It's nothing like it was when you were in school 20 years ago, even. Like, it's just not. The level is, it's ridiculous in terms of precision and athleticism. What was I going to say about that?
So back to this pushing the envelope idea, that this is something that is really important.
I was going to mention, this isn't new. I just wanted to say this isn't new. Beethoven, the late string quartets, super famous example is the Grosse Fuge, the Opus 130. It was supposed to be the first opening movement of Opus 130, right? The string quartet, and the people just literally. At Eastman in the library at Sibley Library, I was reading a book it was published in the 1940s, that said it was an analysis of the Beethoven string quartets, and it said the Grosse Fuge is the master's great mistake. Like, in other words, that's now considered one of his most important and most forward-looking things that he ever did, and student quartets play the hell out of it. And it was because people couldn't play it. They couldn't play it. They didn't know. They didn't know what to make of it. They couldn't get their head around what was supposed to be happening, and how to even. Yeah, in the 1940s, I remember I looked at the publishing. I literally went back. I was like, "What is going on here?" Like, I was hoping to learn something about it, and I found that they just couldn't say much of anything except he was deaf and he was crazy, and this was a mistake. Wow. Whoa. Yeah. That is mind blowing. That really is. That, I mean, if you didn't know that Beethoven was a great composer, people, now you know. That's crazy. That is actually extremely moving to think about. Just from a creative person's perspective, to think about that something has that kind of life, now this puts an unusual amount of pressure and glorification on the composer, right? Because we think, well, Beethoven knew what he was doing, and it took hundreds of years of perseverance
for us to catch up. Yeah,
for us to finally understand the master's vision. Whereas in a band, you might think, and people do this, they say with the Beatles, it was their producer that was really behind a lot of the recording innovations that they made, right? Things like this, like it's a group effort in almost every way. In fact, pop music records, we know they're not just made by committee, they are made by teams of experts doing really incredible things to get incredible sounds out of,
specific pieces. Yeah, today it's actually gotten insane where there might be 100 people accredited on a single track. That studio focus is a really interesting thing, and you actually could say that kind of comes out of art music too, though. That got borrowed a little bit. That's an interesting inflection point and touch point between the two types of music, which is, I'm thinking of the electronic music out of Darmstadt in the 50s. That actually is the first, and Darmstadt was not the only place, just, maybe the most famous place where electronic music began to happen. And it was people like Stockhausen and, the people surrounding him that were creating this studio music that could not possibly in any way be performed live. It wasn't even a possibility. So that I actually think is the real connection. There's a lot of talk. There's been a lot of talk over many years about the Beatles and Stockhausen, and I do like the Beatles. Greg does not. We should probably do an episode on that. But if we really want to piss people off, let's let them listen to Greg talk about the Beatles.
Oh boy.
Yeah, but anyway, I think the actual influence of Stockhausen on the Beatles is less about the sounds, but more about the idea of using the studio as an instrument, as a new idea. And that was so powerful in pop music that it absolutely engulfed it. I mean, there were, the 70s still had bands. The bands were very important in the 70s that would play their music kind of live. But actually, if you listen to those recordings, that's when the 70s was the time when the studio started to enforce its will upon the sound of the music. So if you think of a famous example is the John Bonham drum sound, which became kind of the sound of the 70s drum set. It was very dry. You couldn't hear the room. Everything was close mic'd. You felt like you were inside the drum set, right? It's
an artificial way of hearing a drum set. No one can do that. It doesn't sound real at all.
And that idea, so even though in the 70s we still had bands playing together, right? And they were multi-tracking. A lot of times they were tracking together, but they were isolated sonically. You couldn't, the mics were only catching the drums, or they were only catching this over there. It was about creating these illusory false spaces. And that became so powerful, right? That is absolutely what has taken over pop music. And that has never, ever taken over art music. That studio sound.
This goes back to something we talked about in our last episode, which is, I think, and we're going to get to it, I hope, the function and purpose of this music. The purpose of capturing that John Bonham drum sound is visceral effect. It's party music. It's dance music to a large degree, even if, and you want that beat, the drum set, even
pounding you.
Yeah. The drum set as an invention is just to knock you over the head with that beat. Versus, and that's not what, so how to do it, emphasize it, make it bigger, make it louder, put it through big loudspeakers, amplifiers, etc. This isn't at all the point of reflective or meditative or whatever internal music for listening on the concert stage. In art music world, that's not what it's for. You might want a visceral effect, but you can get that in it's not the focus of it. The timbral effect is not to blast your face. There are effects, and there's lots of timbre important things to talk about there, but anyway, it's a different purpose.
Yeah, and what about the fact that, I'm thinking of, Steve Reich. I was just listening to this amazing version of Music for 18 Musicians being performed and played live, and it was mic'd up to the extent of sounding like a really good studio recording, but it was
by design.
In a live space. Yeah, right. That's actually part of the composition. That's one of the things that makes that kind of music interesting.
Yeah, Steve Reich, I don't know if he was the first, but he certainly was one of the first to insist upon And discuss in the score, the crystal score that we talked about, it's written that the instruments are to be mic'd individually and reinforced on stage in the live space in a PA on a PA. Right?
Do you know what year that was written or premiered?
No, sorry.
Oh, I want to know. I'm going to look it up.
Well, we do have the internet.
Oh, we do, right in front of us. And the reason I think it's interesting and important is in the context of this history that we're talking about, as far as what I would call a real change in music to a studio-based music. You know, Steve Reich, that's what I was thinking. It's the mid-'70s. 76 was its premiere. He worked on it starting in 74. So he was, at that time, not a famous composer yet, I believe, or barely. He was surrounded by popular culture in New York. You know, he certainly was aware of all of these studio innovations that were happening. And he chose to do this really interesting thing, which was like kind of a real crossover thing to do, right? Which is
I know it was a major problem to walk into a concert hall and said, I need everybody mic'd. They didn't have the material or the equipment to do it. And I need them to be, so instantly his music is now louder than everything else on the program. If there's right. And it's coming through a PA. And they don't have the people available to make this happen. The in-house sound mixer and such. Before that, in the 60s, long before that, but in that same whirlwind of activity in New York, Philip Glass was having these musical happenings in these unusual spaces with electronic music, like instruments like organs playing out of amplifiers, but also with acoustic instruments. And they had to balance naturally in the space. But eventually this becomes something that we can, or even think about Barrio's sequenza, what am I thinking of? But anyway, there are vocalists who have to sing into microphones because they have to be heard over the orchestra, and they're not singing operatic style, which is designed to cover over the orchestra. This gets into the spaces that are necessary and available, and now we don't have to have art music in the concert hall. We can have it in alternative venues and record it in a way that's ideal versus what might actually sound on stage, which does start to change the way that the score is conceived of and the music itself is conceived of. And well, this gets into
I would say that overall, still to today, even pieces being written right now, art music is still more focused on the live performance in a space that's more typically concert hall like, that has those acoustical properties that allow sound to carry to an audience, and you
don't do it in a party atmosphere either. People sit quietly.
Yeah, right. And it's because hearing the intricacies and the detail is actually a huge part of the point of that music. Because why? I mean, this is where the cultural question, I think, really where the rubber meets the road. Like, why do we have these art music performances still? And there's been a lot of talk about this. And if you go into the nonprofit world, which is where a lot of the financing is happening for these concert halls and art music performances, there's just people talk all day long about how to bring some of the numbers of pop music into art music. How can we get more people? How can we keep this art form going? It's really been very difficult over the past 20 years or so, especially. And I think this difference that we've identified here is a major impediment to that, probably.
Well, so this goes to why are we talking about this in the first place? And it's because if you pretend that the art music, and I say pretend because I think it's a false belief, if you pretend that the art music, or convince yourself that it should have the same function as Radiohead or whomever, you're going to have a problem. It doesn't have the same function. It's fundamentally not designed to do the same thing for the same reasons, and socially doesn't have this. And the music itself, the language, as we talked about in episode 1, is different. It's different fundamentally, such that they won't, it works in film scores, maybe, where Philip Glass has written many film scores.
Music, yeah.
Sure. So it works to evoke these complex emotions in a film score, but it's not meant for the same thing that popular bands are. And
so let's go into that a little bit. And then I do also want to talk a bit about, the idea of the crossover, which has been very popular again for a while here and ever growing more popular, and I think is honestly probably the impetus for this episode. So
call it the crossover myth.
Is it a myth? But
I'm gonna hide.
This idea of function, yeah, somebody's gonna throw something at you from off screen. This idea of function and the why, I think is the last bit of, you know, the traits and characteristics of this music that I think we haven't really quite addressed. So why are these different types of musics created, and what do those differences mean to us as listeners, to us as creative people, and to us as performers, and to the music itself? So I think there are a few kind of categories, and most of them we've touched on a little bit, but there are a few really underlying pieces to discuss. And one is the listening versus movement piece. We've talked about that as, you know, that popular music, there's an embodiment, a bodily part of it, and even when it's slow or more down, there's still this. It has to do with rhythm. It has to do with pulse. And consistency, right? There's still this embodiment that happens, and it's pushing on your body in a way that I don't think that art music typically does at all. Art music is like pushing your brain. Pop music pushes your body somehow. And I think that well, why do different people want to do those two different things? Why are those, what's different about those?
So this, just to get technical and nerdy for a quick second, I guess. When we were building our company, Clio Music, and I was writing patents for the technology underlying it, one of the things that we took out a provisional patent for was something I called perceptual pulse patterns, the PPP. And the reason is I felt, and I think this is hard to argue with really, is that if you just look at the sonic signature of music, any music as a whole, and you experience perceived pulse patterns from them, it doesn't matter why. It doesn't matter if it's John Bonham's big drum kit or if it's Beethoven going da-dum, 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 da-dum. When you experience that, I don't know what that was. It's my horse riding music. But when you experience that kind of rhythmic flow, perpetual propulsion through pulse patterns, oh my God. When that's happening, plosives, you're getting a certain kind of experience. And we could say it's dance-based, historically. The rhythm is dance-based. But I would say that is categorically very different than the reflective, more narrative. So if it's going to be narrative, you're going to need words to do that over the perpetual pulse patterns of popular produce. Okay. So if you're going to have those beats going, you're going to need lyrics and words to take you on the journey in a narrative story. But otherwise, musically, we can do that. You see, you follow what I'm saying here? Am I confusing myself?
I think what you're saying is, if you are pushing the pulse in a consistent manner, I don't know. We are going to have to, perpetually. And perceptually. Oh my God, we're going to have to do some
perplexing. No, we got to stop. Okay.
We're going to majorly work on the plosives on this episode, I feel. I don't even have a pop filter, so.
No, you
Mike
don't.
is pretty good about that. But yeah, so when you're doing that, you basically, that becomes the primary driver of the feel of the music. And so the rest of what's happening in the music must necessarily be simpler. So when there's a driving, is that kind of what you're saying? So maybe I didn't really get it, the way you're looking at me.
Well, what I'm saying is narrative and journey taking, as we discussed in the language differences and the historic language difference between pop and art music, the journey that you're going to take is much harder to do, I'd say, when you've got dun 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 dun. If that's going to be the entire piece, if that's going to happen for your whole 4 minutes,
if you only have one perceptual pulse pattern.
Yes.
You're only going to be in one space.
And I would argue that a lot of pop music, we know this from our analysis, our computer analysis of this stuff, a lot of pop music is focused on making that one pulse pattern really stick. It's why you hear, well, anyway, so that's important because that gives identity, really strong identity to a piece of pop music. But you don't want that over the course of a Beethoven symphony that lasts 40 minutes.
Yeah, yeah. And there are, I mean, genres of pop music where that's like the entire idea is to break that down into becoming the only thing. Like I think about minimal techno as something that's playing with that idea, and only that idea in a lot of ways. And that's people are so into that they have kind of taken it to its extreme in certain styles.
When you think about music of the class, is going to get in the crossover world. When you think about art music that has crossed over and become a popular signifier of things like the Moonlight Sonata, it's the first movement of the Beethoven piano sonata there, that doesn't, I mean, it has a motivic ostinato, a pattern that does not ever change. It makes it very easy for people to get a vibe and a mood for it that sticks. Now,
well, and when you hear people play that, it does actually change. Well, but nobody ever plays that part.
Right.
Like,
or the second move of the Pathétique.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Those are the two famous openings, and nobody gets to the B section.
Right.
In media, at least. That's really interesting. So the other bit that I think is worth at least a mention, and again, this certainly has a very intense history, and there's a lot of complexity to this topic, but it's the financial driver, right? So, popular music has a very weird history, right? When I say it's derived musically from blues music of the American South, what I'm really saying is, Black people invented this music, and then, I mean, we all know the story, right? White people heard it and were like, hey, I can really snap my fingers to this. I think I can sell this. And it became now there's a business history. And when we call it popular, that's where that word comes from. It comes from the business history of this music, not really from the music itself, but the properties of the music itself allowed this to be true. These tycoons recognized, they recognized that there was potential for everyone to hear this music and want it in their lives, and that turned out to be.
There are language differences here, but as you say, it's not the fault of the music that made it popular; it's the business appropriation.
Well, the business recognized that the language of the music had the potential to be far more popular than classical music ever has been, and that has 100% been true. If you're just looking from a business perspective at music of the 20th and 21st century, popular music won. It won by a million times. There's no, and actually hip hop is what really has won, if you want to get really specific.
And I would argue that in the beginning of recorded media, broadcast media and such, orchestral music was performed regularly, but in the United States, the NBC Orchestra and such, those were, but that didn't catch in the United States. It really was a big deal in Europe, though, differently, because in Europe, with lots of countries the size of most states in the United States, they have their own cultural identities, their own composers. So Germany is very proud of their composers, and they see it like a football team. It's their home team, and France sees their composers as a home team. And they whether or not they really love to sit and listen to Beethoven, I don't know, but I know that culturally it's very well accepted that the state funds financially these things because it's about preserving that culture, which they value very highly in terms of identity. We don't have that here.
And we do kind of have it, but only for pop music. So what America values is its pop musicians. Those are its heroes and celebrities in music, by and large. I mean, there are obviously exceptions to all of this, but I think that financial history is really important, and that financial impetus. And that's really hard for me to talk about as somebody who, I mean, frankly, I'm not a religious person, but songwriting for me is like where I get those spiritual experiences. So to say it's important to me personally is laughable almost. It's so important that I don't even know how to say how important it is. So it's hard for me to say, well, the history of this music that I am so in love with is actually a history of, appropriation and theft and, business tycoons taking people's shit.
And likewise, the music that moves me, that makes me want to get up in the morning and do things, its history is just dominated by exclusion, and it's just all white European men. End of story. That's the canon for many reasons, and anyway, that's very difficult. Very difficult.
Yeah.
I know that I'm a white man, and I've experienced that personally, and but lucky for everyone, I live in a cabin in the woods, and I'm not participating in that world so much today because I don't need to, and more importantly, I have way too much privilege to do that. It's not my, that I don't want to take the air time. It's not worth it. It's not necessary. There are too many people and groups of people who have been excluded in the tradition that I come from.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and both traditions have really tough histories with regard to that. And, as soon as you start talking about the money, that is when those types of exclusions start to come up, and start to talk about the cultural piece of this. So I think that's actually probably a good place to end
There's so much to
episode.
say.
And we're ending it on a down note a bit, but there is a lot to say. And I think, one of the things I'd like to talk about in future episodes, maybe there's a part 3, who knows? We'll see. We haven't talked about a part 3. It's not on the outline, but I think talking about some of the what people consider to be crossover artists and why we look at them that way, and where they kind of fall in this spectrum that we've been describing, I think would be a really fun topic to cover.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
That's good.
Then it's decided. That's what we're going to do.
Excellent.
We're going to get into some actual musical examples and
good.
Look at some specifics. So thanks for having that conversation with me. This is it's kind of cathartic, honestly, because of all this time that I feel like maybe we don't ever have to talk about this again.
Sure. Why not? I mean, there's more to do. We can look ahead to the future. Yeah.
Greg says we have to keep talking about it. No, this is great. This is an absolutely important conversation, and I hope that you've heard a few things that maybe you hadn't thought about before. These are certainly ideas that many of them were very new to me over the past decade or so.
And something we never mentioned, I just want to say on the way out that if you're interested in this kind of collision of our backgrounds and our interests and whatever, and the fact that we get along really well in all kinds of ways, Alison and I do, we collaborate on music, and you can hear the actual synthesis of these ideas and coming together, songwriting and composition we have a project called Dr. Body. And we're making music all the time with that, and there's more to come on there. But you can find us in the normal social media and streaming music places. But the point is, that's where we take songwriting, and then I mess it up with my composition stuff and back and forth, and it's a really, I think, fun and interesting cacophony there of what we do in our approaches. Yeah,
we both allow ourselves in that project the freedom to just be completely impulsive, which is not something that either of us, I think, typically does in most of our music making. So it's a really interesting and fun, at least for us, a really fun project. So I hope you check it out, Dr. Body. And I will say, you will not find us on the typical social channels. You will not find Greg or me on any of the we're not on Instagram.
No, we're on Mastodon. That's important.
Yeah, Mastodon. You can find us on Mastodon. Social networks for nerds is where you'll find us. Hope to see you there. It's actually a lot of fun. If you haven't tried Mastodon and you're at all nerd affiliated,
that's where all the nerds are. So hang out.
Yeah, check it out. Come see us. And we will be back a lot sooner than our season 1 intermission, which was
good,
quite a while.
All right. Well, until next time, thank you so much.
All right. Have a great day wherever you are. Bye bye.